Chapter 1. A Bump in the Night. Myrtle Wilhelmina Mae awoke with a start. Something had scared her out of her sleep. She wasn't afraid of the dark, but of all the things that could be lurking in it. Something strange moved about the darkened room where she was sleeping. Was it a ghost? She thought to herself. She laid there for a few moments, trying to be still and quiet, not wanting to alert whatever was making the noise to her presence. Her eyes peeked over the edge of her comforter into the unlit room. Shadows were dancing on the walls that were a shade darker than the night itself. She swallowed hard and licked her lips quietly. Her mouth had gone quite dry, and she wished her mother had left her a glass of water. Another movement, out of the corner of her eye, made her pull her blankets up even tighter around her face. Maybe it was a mouse. Her dad had told them that there might be rats or mice in the old walls, since the house had sat empty for a few months. Whatever it was, it began making a horrible racket, sending chills and goosebumps all over Myrtle's body. The noise grew in intensity. It now sounded as though it was trapped inside one of the many boxes that lay strewn across the room. It was even beginning to make a wailing sound, like if you placed a jar over someone's head and then hit them on the toe with a hammer. Myrtle was definitely frightened now, but her curiosity was starting to get the best of her. She slid a hand out from under her warm comforter and, in the darkness, fumbled around to find the stand beside her bed. Her hand slowly went farther and farther out into empty space in the darkness. She sure hoped she didn't bump something and make a noise or touch something scary. With fingers flittering in thin air, she finally touched the edge of her nightstand and quietly felt about for the flashlight. Her mother had placed it there before she went to bed, so that if sometime in the middle of the night Myrtle needed to get up to go to the bathroom, she would not stumble and fall. This was their first night in this strange old house, and the electricity had yet to be turned on. Her mother had told them earlier that it was likely to be turned on sometime in the morning. Myrtle's great-aunt, Gertrude Gobblepots, had recently passed on, and in her will had bequeathed Roseberry Manor to Myrtle's mother and father, Marvin and Martha Mae. Aunt Gertrude, according to Myrtle's parents, had been a little loopy in her old age. She had lived alone in the house for several years after Myrtle's father had graduated college, got married, and moved out. She never had any children of her own, and Marvin had been her only living family. Marvin had been raised by Aunt Gertrude after his mother and father had died in a car accident. Aunt Gertrude would never really say very much about them, except that they were very kind people who did a lot for their community and that they loved Marvin very much, and would have loved Martha and their grandchildren as well. Paintings of Myrtle's grandparents hung in the living room next to portraits of Aunt Gertrude and Uncle Axis. Uncle Axis was a May as well, but Aunt Gertrude went back to her maiden name of Gobblepots after Uncle Axis died under strange circumstances. As time went by, Aunt Gertrude came to visit less and less, and she became stranger and stranger. She had grown strange herbs and had never followed traditional paths of medicine. She often carried on long conversations with herself, and even won a few arguments. She often told strange stories to Marvin when he was a child about goblins and their stupidity, but he said he never really believed her. Myrtle didn't remember very much about her great-aunt, but she did remember her kind old face and the excitement in her eyes when she did come for a visit once. She smelled like roses and lilacs, and her light giggle was very contagious. One of the strangest things, however, was a conversation Myrtle had overheard after her great-aunt's funeral. Her parents didn't let her or her brothers go, and they had come home from the service in utter bewilderment. Aunt Gertrude's body had disappeared from the funeral home sometime during the night. She had been at the funeral home the day before, but now she was gone. The funeral director was quite puzzled, and assured them that he had no idea what had happened to it and would do everything he could to find the body. He also explained that since the body was absent and the funeral could not continue, there would be no charges, at least until the body was found. Myrtle's mother had cried all day about the missing body, but Marvin had comforted her, saying that it would probably turn up eventually. Besides, Aunt Gertrude had never really wanted to be buried anyway, and he felt that in an odd twist of events, she would have wanted her body to disappear. So, now they had this big country house and all of its dust-covered contents. The Mays had never owned their own property before, having always rented, so the prospect of having a home that was theirs was gladly welcomed. The 5 of them had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the small town of Portland, Indiana, before they had moved out to the manor in the country. Myrtle's mother, Martha, was a nurse at the local hospital, and her father, Marvin, worked as a teacher at the high school. Money had always been tight for the Mays, and the apartment just had to suffice. Now they each had their own rooms and could stretch their legs a bit. As soon as Myrtle had a grip on the flashlight, she turned it on and stared directly in front of her. Nothing was there, but she could still hear the noises that the creature in the room with her was making. So, as gently as she could, she slid out from under her covers and, after leaning over the edge and checking under the bed, she put her feet to the cold wooden floor and stood up. She swayed the flashlight around that side of the room, checking all areas that she could see. A few empty boxes were sitting there, as well as several more she hadn't unpacked yet. She caught sight of a small spider scurrying across the floor, and she watched it until it disappeared beneath a dresser. The noise seemed to be coming from the foot of her bed, so she took light steps until she was in view of a large box that shook about from whatever was inside. The glow from her flashlight lingered on the box as she realized she was looking at its bottom. Somehow, one of the few empty boxes had fallen over and caught something inside of it, like one of those humane rodent traps. She really hoped it was not a mouse. She did not like mice. She knew she was getting to be a big girl, being 9, almost 10 and all, but she still could not bear the thought of coming into contact with a mouse. Myrtle knew she must see what was inside the overturned box. So she mustered up all of her courage. She reached for the box with her free hand and swiftly lifted it off of the captive. A large ball of fur screeched loudly and flew at her face. Myrtle screamed so loud that she was sure that someone on Roseberry Hill Street would hear her. Her attacker climbed the curtains and ran around the room, all while still making a very frightening noise. Myrtle continued to try and follow it with her flashlight to see what it was. She attempted to shield her face with her other hand just in case it made any attempt to climb her like a tree. Abruptly, the door to her room flew open, and a pair of flashlights, soon followed by 2 more, gleamed into the dark room. Myrtle jumped and pointed her beam of light at the door. "Myrtle, what are you doing?" she heard her mother say. "There's something running around in my room." "What are you talking about?" said her oldest brother, Matthew, who was still half asleep and leaning against the door to her room. He was 13, and everything annoyed him. "I think it ran under my bed," Myrtle said, as she and everyone else turned their flashlights in that direction. Sure enough, just as she said, something was under the bed, ruffling the sheets that were hanging over the edge. Then, whatever it was began emitting a low, throaty growl that slowly built up into a high-pitched screech. "What in the world is that?" Myrtle's mother asked. "I'm not sure," her dad answered calmly. "Let me go take a look." He strode over to the bed, seemingly assured that whatever it was would stay under there, due to the fact that it was surrounded by so much light. He tightened the belt on his terry-cloth robe and slid to the floor, placing his head next to the bedspread. He slowly lifted it and aimed the beam of his flashlight into the darkness. With a ferocious screech, The creature ran at his face and took hold of his head with its claws. He jumped to his feet and ran about the room, swatting at it as everyone saw what the creature really was. In between fits of laughter, Martha attempted to pry the gray cat off of Marvin's face before it could do any major damage. Moments later, after everyone had calmed down, they all gathered in the kitchen. After such a frantic start to the morning, they were all too awake to be able to go back to sleep. So they waited patiently while Martha made them their favorite chocolate chip pancakes. Myrtle sat at the long, worn wooden table in her chair, with the cat calmly nestled in her lap, purring, while she gently petted his soft gray coat. Myrtle's mom said that the cat must have belonged to Aunt Gertrude and was probably starved, unless it had caught a few mice, of course. After many pleas from the children, the grown-ups finally consented to allowing the cat to stay as long as the children agreed that they would take care of it. Myrtle seriously doubted that either one of her brothers would actually help, but that was okay with her. The cat seemed to like her best anyway. Myrtle decided she would call the cat Mr. Screeches, because that's the sound he had been making all night. He seemed to like his name, for he looked up at her and nodded when she gave it to him. She fed him bits of her chocolate pancakes, making sure not to give him the chocolate chips, as they all sat about the table laughing and talking about the most interesting morning they had ever had. Dad even had the marks to prove it.